Assalamualaikum, salam sejahtera. Saya Syamsul Johari dan ini agenda Awani. Gempa Nepal berlaku tercetus lebih kurang sebulan yang lalu dan sehingga kini usaha untuk membangunkan negara Nepal masih lagi berjalan tetapi agak perlahan. Pertubuhan Bangsa-Bangsa Bersatu umpamanya mengatakan bahawa mereka memerlukan sejumlah $51 juta untuk membangunkan semula Nepal. Tapi sehingga kini hanya sekitar 20% sahaja dana tersebut dapat dikumpulkan. Dan antara yang paling terjejas ialah kanak-kanak. Sekitar dianggarkan 1.7 juta kanak-kanak terjejas teruk akibat gempa bumi ini. Dan bagi bercakap atau berbincangkan mengenai isu ini, kita bersama dengan Puan Viviana Belmonte, itu wakil UNICEF ke Malaysia, dan izinkan saya berbahasa Inggeris. Welcome to the show, Ms. Belmonte. And first and foremost, rebuilding Nepal is very critical, and report says that the United Nations only able to get about 20% of their targeted funding. What basically hampers this process?
Well, at the beginning of something as dramatic as what we saw in Nepal a month ago, there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of attention, a lot of media attention, and there are a lot of promises that are made, but they're not necessarily delivered on. And I have to say that one of the things that UNICEF is most grateful for here in Malaysia are many people who, out of the goodness of their hearts, make commitments and donations themselves, and those are 100% reliable, and we make sure that they go and make a difference to saving children on the ground. That first wave of attention, especially from the general public, is the first wave that turns into emergency supplies, that gets things delivered on the ground. And it makes a difference, it really does.
But it doesn't last long, it doesn't carry the momentum, and to be able to rebuild the ancient city, it's not just one earthquake, twice.
Right.
So
right.
There's a huge challenge here.
Well, in a sense, it was three emergencies in one. Nepal, even before the first earthquake struck, was a place where children were very malnourished, chronically undernourished. So there was already, it was a country in need already. Then the first earthquake hit, and it was dramatic, 7.8. That's huge. And we tend to think of that moment, but an earthquake of that size creates many aftershocks. So there was all of that to deal with. And rebuilding was beginning. Certainly the life-saving part had begun in full force.
Correct, much earlier.
And within 2 weeks, all of a sudden, there was a second, also major earthquake. So it was the emergency that existed at the beginning, the first earthquake, and then the one after that. And we kind of call it a children's emergency because when you look at the demographics of Nepal, there are more than close to 50% of the total population are children.
And let us understand, because UNICEF is in Nepal for the last 40 years, you pretty much understand the situation or the problem faced by the children in Nepal. And comparing problems that they have, the issues that they have before the earthquake and now after the earthquake. I understand they are not attending the schools yet. Now there's no school open yet. I mean,
that's right. We haven't been able to reliably open schools again because, particularly because of the second earthquake. But what has happened over the last month is basically putting Nepal backwards several years in terms of its development. Education systems, schools that existed, wiped out overnight, and then in other places, wiped out, ones that had survived, wiped out with the second earthquake. Kids who were in families sometimes lost their parents or their loved ones and are now either without families or we've had to reconnect them. And even for those who are lucky that didn't lose their parents or siblings, the trauma, it's really hard as an adult to put yourself back in the shoes of a 5-year-old, of an 8-year-old, and to think of it's scary enough to think of an earthquake that size as an adult. and think of living through that as a child. And so our experience in emergencies around the world has been, whether it's a cyclone, whether it's a tsunami, whether it's an earthquake, is the best thing that we can do for kids after we've taken care of their immediate food, safety, health, nutrition needs, is to make sure that they go back to school.
All right, we keep that one at the third block. But now, I remember earthquake in Haiti, and that happens many years ago. And
2005,
And until now, pretty much nothing happens. No rebuilding. I mean, I barely read about the economics progress in Haiti. How are we going to make sure that this is not going to happen here in Nepal?
It's a really good question, and I think that people have a right to be cynical sometimes when they see disasters happen and they send help and they feel like nothing happens. In the case of Haiti, for example, Haiti is the exceptional country in the Western Hemisphere. It is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. It has under 5 mortality rates that are like sub-Saharan Africa in terms of just the indicators that we normally use. So this was a country that was already, that really, where a lot of work needed to happen. And the earthquake and the size of that earthquake as well really was totally devastating. These things take time. That's not at all an excuse. But it's also a reality of things don't happen overnight. And in a way, earthquakes have a kind of a personality. In the first few days, the first 48, 72 hours, the business of emergency work is making sure that you get survivors out of the rubble. Reach them, whatever it takes, you reach survivors, because after that, you head into another phase. And it's more about cleaning up and trying to make sure that disease doesn't start to spread. And then once you've got that sort of second phase, then you start reaching the sort of phases of slowly but surely going into recovery and rebuilding. And that's not easy work. And it's not easy work when the cameras are gone. It's the kind of work we're doing right now. The cameras are gone. The work has to happen. It does take funding to get the work done. And so we really appreciate having a chance to
Thank you.
walk through a little bit what is going on right now.
All right, we have to take a very short break for a while, and when we come back, we'll talk about the rural area. When the first earthquake struck, the challenge was for the aid workers to basically disseminate all the aids, the food and the medical supplies, not just in Kathmandu but to the rural area. Because my colleague went there. The story is about the access to the rural area being cut off. So how to rebuild a country without proper facilitation and all that, we have to take a very short while. Kita akan jumpa kembali selepas. Bertemu lagi dalam bahagian Awani, masih bersama Puan Wivina Belmonte, itu wakil UNICEF ke Malaysia. And before we take a short break, I would like to know, I asked you about the problems and the challenges faced by the emergency workers and organizations such as yours to disseminate the aid, because challenge in terms of getting there. Do you have friends there? Maybe you can share their stories?
Yeah, certainly UNICEF has been in Nepal for 40 years. We've got colleagues who have been working day in, day out throughout the emergency since the first earthquake hit. Our concern in Nepal and everywhere we work is to reach all children. Clearly, there's going to be a lot of children in the capital just by the virtue of the population.
Okay. All right.
But Nepal is a country of is a rural country, and it's reaching all of those villages across the country, and it's, you know, the roads are not very common. I mean, you can get aid in to a certain place, but after that, in many places, it's about donkeys getting the aid on donkey backs and going through trekking routes and reaching remote communities in the Himalayas. So the logistical challenge is always one of our major concerns. The other thing that our experience shows us is people will be familiar of seeing images of in the middle of a horrible emergency and aid finally arriving and people being really desperate and desperately going to get the aid. And in a way, there's relief in that because people are finally getting something. But what we think about is, great that these people are getting the aid. What about those who can't even reach there? Who are either not able-bodied or because they're in a rural community or whatever. And because we know where these communities are, because we work in them regularly, we want to make sure that they also get what they so desperately need. And that's the work at hand right now.
Do you face, UNICEF in Nepal face a challenge? I mean, will you be able to, have you be able to send them aid and get in touch with them?
So for colleagues who have been going to the more remote parts, one of the interesting stories was about, after the first earthquake, going around to some of the very basic schools and putting up red and green signs on all of them. Red meant the school was not safe to be in, so not to be reopened. Green, it's fine, we can work within this structure, it'll be safe for kids. And as they were going through that process with people from the Ministry of Education and people from the community, the second earthquake hit. And there's a friend of mine was saying that he was on the second floor, and all that they wanted to do was get downstairs, get outside, get away from the structure so that it didn't cave in on them, and get to safety. Of course, that school got a red sign, and they had to go back all over again in all of the remote communities that they'd been to and do the red and green system again.
In this kind of time, I mean, do you have problems with governments? I mean, how to get people buy-in?
No, we work with the Nepalese government all the time, the Ministry of Education and others. The Ministry of Health is really important in a situation like that. The Ministry of Water and Sanitation to make sure that clean water is reestablished. Water is a life-saving thing, huh?
Correct.
And the Ministry of Health for hospitals and the grid, the infrastructure, in as much as it exists.
UNICEF doesn't have any problem with
we work with them all the time.
Authorities.
Yeah, and everybody's interest is let's get things back up and running. But not only back up and running, can we get them back up and running in a place that is prone to earthquakes, and to do it in a way that maybe they can buffer against future shocks.
Like what happened in Aceh.
Exactly.
When United Nations and all the agencies and charities rebuilding Aceh, they rebuilt with much better material and all that. Can we take Aceh and Aceh example, Aceh rebuilding example to Nepal?
That was the big lesson out of Aceh and the tsunami in Southeast Asia generally, that out of tragedy, if you can pull some sort of opportunity out of tragedy, it was to build back better. So if you're going to be dedicating that kind of the resources to rebuild, then rebuild in a way that can try and help you make sure that you don't face the situation again.
Correct.
In the case of Aceh, that was also things like for early warning systems, but also for structures themselves. In the case of Nepal, that will be an element.
What went wrong? I mean, what kind of material that they used before, and what would be enhancement?
Well, I think that Nepal has always been people were bracing themselves for the big one in Nepal. Anyone who's worked in Nepal, I'm sure that some of your viewers may have visited Kathmandu or Pokhara or parts of Nepal. Everyone was bracing for the big one. You know that Nepal is by a tectonic plates.
Yeah.
So it's going to happen. I'm not sure that you can fully build against an earthquake of that size. But can you build buildings that will withstand smaller earthquakes? Can you maybe come up with early warning systems? Those are the questions that people are looking at.
All right. And the discussion, of course, will be targeted to the children. 1.7 million children. They are we call more than 50% of the whole population of Nepal, and they are suffering. And we have to take another short break. And when we get back, we'll talk about rebuilding life of the children of Nepal.
Perfect.
How to bring them back to school, and such a trauma. If an adult, my friend Maria, she actually experienced a second shock, and I know how she felt. I mean, just imagine what would children feel. So we're going to talk about that after we come back. Anda masih menonton agenda Awani bersama saya, Syamzan Johari, dan juga tamu saya, Wakil UNICEF ke Malaysia, Puan Wivina Belmonte, bercakap mengenai genap sebulan tragedi gempa bumi Nepal. Dan rebuilding lives of children, this is the pinnacle of the whole rebuilding process. How to get them back to their life before earthquake, how to get them back to school. After 2 earthquakes, I don't think there are a lot of safe buildings for you to make the access school. So, what's your story?
Well, when UNICEF thinks of a school, we normally think of a building. But when we think of a school in an emergency, we don't think of buildings anymore.
Oh, yeah?
We think of canvas tents. We think of safe spaces where you can set up a tent, and even something as rudimentary as that, until schools are safe for kids to go back to, is a critical sort of first wave of aid for us. Why? Because after the trauma of 1 and then 2 earthquakes, kids, the best thing that you can do for kids is to bring some kind of normalcy back. What feels normal to a child is going to school. They may like it, they may not like it, but it is something they're familiar with. Correct. So getting those tents up and running, where we have, yes, teachers, but we also have psychosocial specialists who they know how to, if a child is not comfortable talking about a trauma, but you can see that they're really affected, they sometimes ask them to draw things, and there are just ways of helping children deal with what they've lived through.
To let it go.
Start to let it go and start to speak of it in whatever way is comfortable for a child. It may not be asking them directly, how are you feeling? It may be, why don't you draw, what are you dreaming about? And doing it that way.
Do you have additional volunteers sent to, or workers sent to Nepal for this purpose, getting them back to school?
We don't have volunteers for this. We actually have professionals who do it, and who sometimes train local community people. That way you also get over language barriers, or some of our Nepalese staff take care of that. And then you make sure that that also teachers that the children themselves are familiar with do some of this teaching themselves. So you add that element to what the teacher would normally do.
So getting them back to school, what's the progress so far?
Not as good as we'd like, to be honest. We were set 2 weeks after the first earthquake to start reopening schools. the second earthquake just really, it devastated buildings that had been safe, and the earlier ones got knocked down even further. So we're still very much at the canvas schools, tents, and we've set up a lot of those in safe spaces in Kathmandu. We've started doing it in more than half of the districts across Nepal that were affected. So in that sense, in the this is as good as it can be for now. We're doing what we can, but the actual building of schools, that is really a top priority.
So how can we help?
Well, the funding needs are still important. So for people who have been generous or for people who want to help in this phase of the recovery, we welcome your help. It makes a huge difference. We've talked about education. There are still very basic health needs. We're running vaccination campaigns to make sure that kids continue to be safe health-wise and that that disease does not spread, because to add that to everything else now would be disastrous. So the funding needs are really the best way of helping from here to get immediate impact there.
So UNICEF, we are open to donations online. In fact, you can go to the UNICEF website.
Right.
And those donations made online will be sent to Nepal, I guess.
The full donation goes to our Nepal country office, where they implement. They get the supplies that are needed. We're often asked in emergencies, especially at the beginning, can we send blankets? Can we send buckets? Can we send clothes? And we always say that the best thing that you can do is to send money, because it also helps reactivate whatever economy is there. And then you're buying things locally so that people are familiar with the products that they're getting. So what we try to do is to take the goodwill that happens through an emergency at the beginning, in the middle, or at the stage that we're at, and based on experience determine what is most needed, how can your generosity make the biggest difference, and that's what we do.
Right, thank you very much, Madam Wivina Belmonte, Wakil UNICEF ke Malaysia, bercakap mengenai genap sebulan tragedi gempa bumi di Nepal dan juga kehidupan mangsa-mangsa di sana, terutama kanak-kanak, dan bagaimana kita boleh membantu. Alamat atau URL bagi membantu tabung UNICEF juga kami letakkan dalam tika sastra Awani dari semasa ke semasa. Anda boleh terus menghantarkan atau memberikan derma anda melalui alamat URL tersebut. Sekian saja agenda Awani malam ini. Sebarang cadangan hantarkan ke platform-platform sosial media kami. Saya Syamzan Johari. Assalamualaikum. Salam hormat.